When you think about summons, it's hard not to think about Bahamut. Known as the Conqueror of the Skies, or the Dragon King, Bahamut has exuded power, elegance, and grace in each of its many appearances. And due to the sheer spectacle often afforded to players via powerful moves like Megaflare, it's rare that Bahamut has failed to leave a lasting impression. This has created an enduring legacy that has now spanned over 30 years, and it's been accomplished by a steady process of evolution. Bahamut was known within Arabian mythology as a gigantic sea monster who underpinned the support structure that held up the earth. This made Bahamut similar to Atlas from Greek mythology, but instead of being referenced in a direct capacity, the connection with Bahamut in Final Fantasy came via an intermediary. When Dungeons & Dragons was being crafted, the creators scoured numerous mythologies alongside the works of countless contemporary fantasy authors. This was done to create a new world unlike anything seen before, and effort was placed on crafting what they had found into something that would make sense within the world they envisioned. In 1975, this saw the creation of the Dragon King, who is also known as the Platinum Dragon. In the years that followed, the Dragon King was named Bahamut, and within the context of the lore of Dungeons & Dragons, Bahamut was positioned as the king of good dragons, someone who had compassion and empathy for the weak, but would rather provide healing, information or support as opposed to fighting alongside those who were deemed capable of fighting for themselves. Acting in opposition was Tiamat, the Chromatic Dragon. Positioned as the Queen of Evil Dragons, Tiamat was Bahamut's evil twin sister, and as the lore of Dungeons & Dragons built out, the feud with Tiamat was a recurring theme. Such was the depth of what had been established within Dungeons & Dragons that the next generation of fantasy creators had a wealth of content from which they could be inspired. And in the context of Final Fantasy, throughout this video, we will explore how faithful Square were to what was seen within Dungeons & Dragons and the steps they took to build out their own interpretation of the Platinum Dragon in order to create what has become one of the most popular summons in the history of the franchise. This is the complete evolution of Bahamut. When initial work was underway on the original Final Fantasy, numerous entertainment properties were used as inspiration. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been wanting to make an RPG for some time, had a fondness for games such as Wizardry and Ultima, and Akitoshi Kawazu had always been impressed with Dungeons & Dragons. It saw many elements of Final Fantasy inspired by these properties, and in the context of the game's lore, it saw the faithful inclusion of a non-playable character called Bahamut. As had been the case within Dungeons & Dragons, Bahamut was classified as the King of the Dragons. He could be found on the Cardia Islands deep within the Dragon Caves, and should the party deliver the rat tail, Bahamut would provide assistance by enhancing their abilities. This would encourage the party to fight their own battles, as opposed to relying on the strength of Bahamut, and with his assistance, the party were able to defeat his nemesis, Tiamat. It was a very derivative storyline, but there was one twist with the inclusion of Bahamut. Instead of being platinum, Bahamut was orange, something that was then changed within later ports. Bahamut next appeared within Final Fantasy III, but instead of continuing to be very derivative, what we saw was the establishment of a much more fleshed out and original interpretation of Bahamut. In the basic sense, Bahamut was still a dragon, and much like in the original game, he still featured a garish orange overworld sprite. But that was where the similarities ended. Bahamut transitioned from being a benevolent being to being one who antagonized the party. And in the initial sense, this resulted in an unwinnable battle taking place against Bahamut on the top of a mountain, as opposed to deep within a cave. In the battle, Bahamut sported a more traditional appearance befitting the Platinum Dragon, and he utilized a brand new move which has since become iconic, Megaflare. Following the conclusion of the duel, Bahamut retreated to his lair, a cave located southeast of Viking's Cove, and it was here that the party could take part in an optional battle. If defeated, Bahamut then deviated further from the established lore as he could be called upon in combat to assist the party, and in this regard he was the highest tier of summon magic available. Depending on the job that initiated the summon, Bahamut could then perform one of three moves: Aura, Rend, or Megaflare, with the latter move performing significant amounts of non-elemental damage. It was a significant deviation from what had been seen before, but it was a bold move, and it paid off. And we would also like to make a bold move in this moment, because in the near future, we plan to play through Final Fantasy III live on Twitch as part of our quest to play through every single major game in the franchise. If you'd like to watch, then please follow us. Our username is Lozadar, and there's a link in the description below. Final Fantasy IV carried forward much of what was added in Final Fantasy III, but compared to the two previous installments, the role of Bahamut was diminished. Deviating from established lore, Bahamut was known as the King of Eidolons as opposed to the King of Dragons, and he resided on the Red Moon in the Lair of the Father, also known as the Cave of Bahamut. Here he awaited the challenge of a warrior capable of rising to the heavens, but thus far, none who had sought the challenge had passed the test. Should the party have already defeated Asura and Leviathan, they could take this test, engaging in an optional battle with the Platinum Dragon. If successful, the player would gain access to the highest tier of summon magic available, as Bahamut would grant Rydia access to his powerful Megaflare attack. Final Fantasy IV also introduced a new concept, Strains of Bahamut. Within the Lunar Subterrane, Dark Bahamut could be encountered as an optional battle, and the victors were granted access to Cecil's ultimate weapon. Final Fantasy V continued the diminishment of Bahamut, as his role within the narrative and wider lore was almost non-existent. Using the tablet obtained within the Pyramid of Moor would break a seal that contained Bahamut, and after obtaining freedom, Bahamut settled atop the North Mountain, a throwback to Final Fantasy III. Should the party venture to the top, they could challenge Bahamut. This was again an optional battle, but it brought about an unexpected change as Bahamut was black as opposed to being platinum or metallic. Never before had a black dragon appeared within the franchise, and although it may have been coincidental, the ominous appearance of Bahamut in Final Fantasy V had parallels with the portrayal of black dragons as antagonists within Dungeons & Dragons. Should Bahamut be bested, summoners would gain access to Megaflare, but unlike the two prior games, even though Bahamut was within the highest tier of summon magic, this was not a unique quality anymore, as Leviathan and Phoenix both featured within the same tier. Final Fantasy VI featured a narrative that centered around Espers. They were magical beings created during the War of the Triad, and in the midst of the War of the Magi, they created a new realm where they could live in peace. But even though numerous Espers featured within the narrative, such as Valigarmander, Ramuh, and Maduin, the role of Bahamut was relegated to nothing more than a cameo. Unlike every prior installment, this meant Bahamut no longer had a physical presence in the story. It had been common for Bahamut to appear as an optional boss where he would test would-be heroes. Only if defeated would he grant them the power of Megaflare. This concept remained, but the notion regressed as the optional fight was no longer against Bahamut. It was instead against Deathgaze, a challenging enemy that needed to be hunted down numerous times. Only if the party was successful in this endeavour would they then acquire the Bahamut Magicite. When summoned, Bahamut would cast Megaflare, one of the most powerful offensive attacks performed by any Esper. But as had been the case within the previous installment, Bahamut was chromatic instead of platinum. Final Fantasy VII continued the notions of summons being stored within an object, and this time the object was materia. Orbs of materia could be found throughout the world, and amongst the numerous types available, summon materia was some of the rarest. Due to this narrative device, Bahamut again had no physical presence, nor did it have any role in the story. The method of acquisition also regressed further, but there was a significant evolution. Instead of there being only one strain of Bahamut, Final Fantasy VII built upon what had been seen within Final Fantasy IV to introduce two new strains of Bahamut. In addition to Bahamut, it meant we also saw Neo Bahamut and Bahamut Zero. Instead of undergoing an optional test of metal, each of these strains could simply be found and picked up, but they were at least still missable. Bahamut appeared on the floor after defeating a mandatory boss, the Red Dragon. This was an interesting association, as within the lore of Dungeons & Dragons, Red Dragons were aligned with the Chromatic Dragon, and Bahamut was black, just as he had been within the two previous installments. When summoned, Bahamut used Megaflare, and its utility evolved as it now ignored magic defense. But due to the emergence of the two other Bahamut strains, even though Megaflare was powerful, it was no longer in the highest tier of summon magic. Neo Bahamut could be found lying on the floor in the Whirlwind Maze. When summoned, players would bear witness to a Crimson Red Bahamut for the first time, and they would also bear witness to a brand new move called Gigaflare. This retained all the hallmarks of the new, evolved version of Megaflare, but dealt more damage, making it a superior move. But even this paled in comparison to the power of Bahamut Zero. This could be obtained through two different methods, but neither involved any direct conflict. The preferred route was to interact with the blue huge materia after acquiring Bahamut and Neo Bahamut, but should this route be blocked, Bahamut Zero could be dug up from the Bone Village. When summoned, Bahamut Zero continued the chromatic alignment, but its power was immense, and Terraflare, a brand new move, was only outclassed by Knights of the Round. Final Fantasy VI and VII saw much deviation in terms of how Bahamut was represented, but Final Fantasy VIII served as a mini revival as many of the established characteristics returned. Bahamut was an optional boss that could be found hidden within the Deep Sea Research Center, and this was a throwback to earlier games where Bahamut would often be found within a cave. Bahamut also had some lore. Upon entering the research center, players would have their virtue questioned, and they would only be allowed to challenge Bahamut if he deemed their answers satisfactory. Should the party be successful, they gained access to Megaflare, a move that denoted Bahamut as the second strongest summon, only bested by Eidolon. And like in Final Fantasy VII, this non-elemental move ignored magic defense. With Tiamat even appearing on the opposite side, serving as a minion of Ultima Seer in her castle, it represented a small return to form for the Platinum Dragon, and in this regard, his appearance matched expectations, as for the first time since Final Fantasy IV, Bahamut had a metallic sheen with a platinum twist. Final Fantasy IX then represented Bahamut in a way that was befitting of the theme of the game, as it borrowed elements from numerous prior installments. For the first time since Final Fantasy III, Bahamut was an active participant within the story, but it wasn't in a sentient capacity, as he was being controlled by Kuja, and this forced him to be an antagonist. Tiamat also appeared as a guardian of terror, a weaker manifestation of an Eidolon. This then placed Tiamat on the opposite side of Bahamut, who was an Eidolon of Gaia. Final Fantasy IX's Bahamut has an appearance that mirrored the weakest strain of Bahamut in Final Fantasy VII, with a black body, purple wings, and tan torso, and it was acquired in a similar manner as it was associated with an item that came into the party's possession via natural progression. When used, Bahamut would perform Megaflare, but unlike the two previous games, it no longer ignored magic defense. It was still very powerful though, and ranked as one of the top tier summons that were available to Garnet. As Final Fantasy VI had done years prior with Espers, Final Fantasy X featured a narrative that revolved around Aeons. They appeared as physical realizations of the Faith's dreams and could communicate with summoners who prayed to them within the Chamber of the Faith. Numerous Aeons appeared in this fashion, but the one who had the biggest impact on the narrative was Bahamut. For the first time in the franchise, Bahamut assisted the party by providing useful information, and this had a direct impact on Tidus, who after learning the truth of his existence from Bahamut, was motivated to defeat Yevon even though he knew it would come at great personal cost. Due to his central role, Bahamut was a mandatory acquisition, but there was no challenging battle present as a barrier to this acquisition. Bahamut could be fought, however, numerous times, but only when summoned by another. After this acquisition, Bahamut would perform Megaflare when called upon, and for the first time, this move broke the damage limit innately. But even though Bahamut was the strongest storyline Aeon, it wasn't top tier, as Anima, the Magus Sisters and Yojimbo provided more firepower and more utility. Final Fantasy X also saw an old concept resurfaced from Final Fantasy IV. Dark Bahamut could be found in the Zanaken's dome, and it needed to be defeated in order to gain access to the fight against Penance. Final Fantasy XI did not feature summons within its initial outing, but as expansion packs started to release, they became prominent parts of the experience. called avatars, they were positioned as magical beings and they were classified into various groupings. There were the sleeping gods, who were also known as the 8 celestial avatars, and the 5 terrestrial avatars, who were born of Vana'diel and were tasked with protecting the 5 mother crystals. Bahamut fell into the second category, and he came to prominence within the Chains of Promathia storyline. This saw a significant return to roots, as for the first time since Final Fantasy I, Bahamut was designated as the King of Dragons, or the Worm King. In this role, Bahamut served as a pseudo-antagonist. As a terrestrial avatar, Bahamut wanted to protect Vana'diel no matter the cost, and due to a pact made with Celtius, this saw Bahamut attempt to destroy humanity. They feared the arrival of the Keeper of the Apocalypse, also known as Promathia, but believed that if humanity was destroyed, there would be no reason for Promathia to return. Bahamut continued with this folly despite pleas from old allies and new heroes, but even after Promathia was defeated, Bahamut still remained unconvinced that humanity was strong enough to survive further calamities and returned to challenge them as a storyline boss and as an optional boss. In these fights, Bahamut would use numerous moves, including Megaflare, Gigaflare, and Terraflare, and this was the first time a single strain of Bahamut had access to all 3 iterations of its iconic move. It was also the first time that these moves were aligned with an element, as they each dealt fire damage. Defeating Bahamut gave access to rare, exclusive equipment and weaponry, and this harkened back to Final Fantasy I, as Bahamut assisted the party in an indirect capacity as opposed to becoming a summonable asset. Final Fantasy XII chose to use its unique Ivalice Espers instead of those that had featured in prominent fashion throughout the rest of the franchise, and this meant Bahamut did not feature in a direct capacity. There were allusions though. The Empire named airships after prominent summons, and Sky Fortress Bahamut was the flagship of the Imperial fleet. And as the story came to a dramatic conclusion, Vayne Solidor was confronted atop the Sky Fortress, where he merged with Vanar to become the Undying, a draconic being. It was a clear reference to the Sky Fortress's namesake, and to make the reference even clearer, the Undying made use of Megaflare and Terraflare, as well as a sword attack named Gigaflare Sword. Final Fantasy XIII saw a return to the traditional suite of summons. They were called Eidolons, and although they didn't have huge roles, they were ingrained in the narrative as each member of the main cast had an Eidolon they were associated with. Bahamut was associated with Fang. In this regard, Bahamut appeared as a mandatory storyline boss in the 5th arc, and his visual design was colourful but had distinct platinum accents. His responsibility was to challenge Fang and bring her back from her moment of weakness. And after overcoming this challenge, Fang could then call upon Bahamut as an ally in battle, and its Gestalt mode finisher was Megaflare. Final Fantasy XIV then blew everything prior out of the window by providing the most comprehensive representation of Bahamut we had ever seen before within the franchise. Bahamut was one of the first brood, 7 great worms who were amongst the oldest living and most powerful beings on Eidolon. As time passed, the dragons often came into conflict with mortal beings, and during the 3rd Astral Era, Bahamut was slain when his dwelling was attacked by the Allagan Empire. This caused much distress to the other great worms, one of which was Tiamat. As had been the case within Dungeons & Dragons, Tiamat appeared as Bahamut's sister, but they were no longer positioned as opposites. After learning of Bahamut's fate, Tiamat was manipulated into summoning a primal in the image of Bahamut, but unbeknownst to her, the Allagan Empire had been taught a method through which this new Bahamut could be subdued and used. It saw Bahamut incarcerated within an artificial satellite, but when Bahamut was free during the 6th Astral Era, he sought revenge against the realm and displayed clear antagonistic qualities. It resulted in a devastating assault that served as a climax to Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, and as the conflict waged on, Bahamut was defeated, but he wasn't slain. Instead, Bahamut retreated to the binding coil of Bahamut, and in the 7th Astral Era, Bahamut attempted to regenerate its damaged body so that it could once again seek revenge against mortals. Players could then venture to the binding coil of Bahamut to take part in an optional raid, and after progressing to turn 4 of the final coil of Bahamut, Bahamut would appear in all his glory as the Platinum Dragon to serve as the final boss of the Binding Coil storyline. During this battle, Bahamut Prime would use Megaflare, Gigaflare and Terraflare, as well as numerous other moves, one of which was called Megaflare Dive. Upon completing the final coil, much as had been the case within Final Fantasy XI, spoils were granted in the form of equipment, but unlike that game, summoners were able to call upon Demi Bahamut to assist them in battle.
The fate of this world falls to the King of Kings.
Final Fantasy XV continued the notion of giving Bahamut a comprehensive backstory, although its motivations were made more ambiguous. Bahamut served as the god of the astrals, much as he had done within Final Fantasy IV, and within the context of the game's lore, he had descended from a higher plane, existing in a realm between the physical, from which he oversaw and looked to guide the evolution of Eos. This saw Bahamut take an active role in the narrative as he influenced proceedings, but whether he can be called the antagonist is down to interpretation. In his role, Bahamut supported humanity. He gave them access to the crystal and provided guidance to Noctis when the time came for him to assume the role as king, but he also betrayed and manipulated Arden and became the source of his ire. Bahamut also took an active stance in the conflict against Ifrit, appearing for the first time in the franchise as a one-time summon. At this time, Bahamut displayed its power by using the Ultima Sword instead of Megaflare, as this was instead reserved for usage when destroying Arden's wall. Unlike the other Astrals, Bahamut could not be called on during other times of strife, and he did not appear as an optional or mandatory battle within the main campaign, something that had not happened since Final Fantasy IX. He did though appear as the final mandatory boss in the game's multiplayer expansion, Comrades. Outside of the main numbered games, Bahamut has featured in numerous ways within the expanded franchise. Its story continued within Final Fantasy IV thanks to Interlude and The After Years. Bahamut featured in this regard as both an ally alongside Rydia and as an opposite alongside the Mysterious Girl. 2 additional strains of Bahamut appeared within the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. Bahamut Sin was summoned by Kadaj in Advent Children, and this strain introduced a new iteration of Megaflare called Exaflare, as well as traditional platinum colouring. Exaflare was then used by another strain called Bahamut Fury. This appeared as a boss in Crisis Core, and it represented the first time Bahamut was given golden scales. Bahamut and Bahamut Zero appeared within Before Crisis with no significant deviation, and a reimagined version of Bahamut resurfaced in more recent times in Chadley's combat simulator in the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Here, Bahamut used Megaflare and was the strongest summon in the game. He also reverted back to traditional platinum colouring. Bahamut did not appear within the roster of Espers that featured in Final Fantasy XII, but he did appear in Final Fantasy Tactics as a powerful summon. Bahamut was also present in Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings after being summoned by Judge of Wings. This positioned Bahamut as a boss, but it could be summoned later on, and Megaflare was the signature move. Following the conclusion of Final Fantasy XIII, Lightning aligned herself with Bahamut, and she used this alliance to save Noel and escape Caius. But the more prominent depiction of the venerable summon came through Caius. Due to his close connection, Caius could transform into an iteration of Dark Bahamut called Chaos Bahamut, and this was then upgraded to Jet Bahamut, who could even summon additional versions of Bahamut in support. Bahamut was aligned with the Vermilion Bird Crystal in Final Fantasy Type 0, and it was one of the main weapons during the Militesi invasion. Bahamut could also be obtained as a summon during the second playthrough, and he had access to Megaflare. But in an interesting ode to the past, Neo Bahamut and Bahamut Zero could also appear if certain feats were accomplished. Bahamut also appeared as an optional boss in numerous iterations of Four Heroes of Light. In the first instance, it could be found on the 80th floor of the Moonsand Ruins, and in both of the Bravely games, Bahamut could be fought alongside Ominous Crow. Bahamut has appeared in numerous mobile titles. These have often just referenced earlier iterations, but within Final Fantasy Dimensions, we got to see something unique, a young Bahamut who was known as Muti. This also represented the first time Bahamut was a playable character, and it was very unorthodox. Dimensions even featured a new interpretation of Chaos Bahamut, as well as numerous original strains of Bahamut called Erd Bahamut, Verth Bahamut, and Skald Bahamut. Dissidia has featured Bahamut in numerous ways. Within the original Dissidia, Bahamut was one of the summons available to players, and in Dissidia Duodecim, Yuna could call upon Bahamut from her own world. In Dissidia NT, Bahamut was one of the 7 party-based summons, and in this role he had access to Megaflare, Gigaflare, and Terraflare. But that's where we're going to stop. Bahamut has appeared in almost every single Final Fantasy game ever made, but as many of these appearances have been quite derivative, there's no real value in running through them all as some kind of checklist. Instead, we are just going to reflect on what has been a fascinating study. Bahamut was, in its initial form, very derivative of Dungeons & Dragons, but as the franchise built out, the way in which Bahamut has been used has seen so much change. There have been common traits though. Bahamut was often included as an optional boss and would assist the party in some way, by either granting information or enhancing the party, or by offering its own power as a summonable entity. Earlier games placed a lot of focus on where Bahamut could be found to undertake this optional battle, but this trait drifted away. Bahamut's role within the story has also seen a lot of deviation. Sometimes Bahamut has appeared as the benevolent being that is depicted in the lore of Dungeons & Dragons, but many other games have positioned Bahamut as an antagonist. It's also interesting to see that the MMOs went quite extreme with the antagonistic arc, with Bahamut having a similar objective in both games but a very different motivation. Nonetheless, we hope you have enjoyed this retrospective view of how Bahamut has appeared and subsequently evolved throughout the Final Fantasy franchise. Chris, aka Hugathy on Discord, and I had a lot of fun pulling this together, as we haven't ever done an evolutionary topic like this before, so it would be great to get some feedback. Did you enjoy it, and would you like to see us tackle more summons in the same manner? If the answer is yes, then please do let us know by either commenting down below or liking the video. Make sure you subscribe as well, as we have plenty of other evolutionary topics that we can't wait to delve into in the near future. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.